It's a Friday night. I'm 22 years old, standing behind the hostess stand at Bogota Latin Bistro in Brooklyn, playing my favorite game. Guess their order. A cute, awkward couple comes in. I clock it as a first date. They'll order a platanos appetizer to share, then separate main courses that are easy to eat with a fork and knife while chatting. Doe-eyed lovers walk in next. They are definitely getting shareables. Ceviche, I'll bet. Something they can eat with their hands. Playing this game kept me fully entertained during long restaurant shifts. And what I witnessed many nights was just how intimately food and sexuality are connected. Some of those links are obvious. Food and sex are both pleasurable sensory experiences. But if you dive into the cultural history of our erotic and alimentary appetites, and even into your own sensory memories, you will find that the connection goes much deeper. This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao.
Well, I've always been in love with food. I had eyes bigger than my stomach when I was a kid. But I'd say from the time I started dating, food was always pretty central in all of my relationships.
That's Rachel Hope Cleaves, a historian and professor at the University of Victoria. Her interest in the erotic side of food is partly academic. She's the author of Lustful Appetites, An Intimate History of Good Food and Wicked Sex. That book investigates everything from restaurant sex commerce to the appetites of queer women in the early 1900s. But her observations are also personal.
I remember with my very first boyfriend, my first real boyfriend, which was in 10th grade, we would cut school in the afternoons often. I grew up in New York City, and we would go to this Italian deli in the Lower East Side, which is where our school was. And I would buy a roast beef sandwich with mayonnaise, lettuce, tomato, and black pepper. And it was like just when I started eating pepper, because I was like, just becoming like an adult in my palate. And we'd go back to his apartment and we'd share this sandwich. And I knew I was falling in love with him when I wanted to give him the bigger half of the sandwich. I was like,
I love that.
So, yeah.
That's so great. So we can't get too far into this conversation without mentioning the word aphrodisiac, which is definitely the first thing that pops into my mind when I think about food and sex. And I want to start with the biggest and maybe hardest question first. So is the power of aphrodisiacs real?
It's real if you believe it.
Oh, no. Okay. Tell me more.
I don't believe in the inherent power of any food to spark the libido, although I do think that there are foods that their mouthfeel evokes sexual experiences for us, and so maybe they do put us more in the mood. But I don't believe any of the theories about like high levels of zinc in oysters or something. So I subscribe to the belief that the biggest sex organ we all have is the one between our ears. So, anything that stimulates the brain is an aphrodisiac. So, yes, if you believe your food is an aphrodisiac, it is.
Well, so why, I guess, how did we come to have these certain associations with particular foods? Maybe let's talk about oysters in particular. Why do we associate oysters with sex?
Well, the oysters and all seafood are associated with sex, and for a variety of reasons. First of all, it traces back to like the root of the word aphrodisiac, which is Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And in the Greek mythology, she's born from the sea, right, and rises up on a seashell. And so any food of the sea in ancient Greece was considered aphrodisiac, like fish were considered an aphrodisiac. Not a food that was fit for sacrifice, but something that you ate for pleasure. And then there's a homology for oysters. They look like vulvas, right? They taste briny. They taste like a vulva. So they evoke sexuality for that reason. And there's a lot of that sort of homological thinking in the history of aphrodisiacs. So things that looked phallic were often seen as aphrodisiacs. Things that were considered in Galenic theory to heat the blood and cause the production of sperm. Those were considered to be aphrodisiacs. Often, like luxurious or rich foods were considered to be heating. And if they
Interesting.
heated you up, they caused sperm. And then my favorite variety of historic aphrodisiac thinking was that flatulent foods were aphrodisiacs. And this was a medical theory that erections were caused by gases. And so
What?
anything that was gas producing would be erection producing. But then there was a sort of medical debate about whether a gas produced erection was likely to be as like seed rich as a non-gas produced erection. So like
Oh
maybe it was like
my
a false
gosh.
erection.
Wait, this is hilarious because I would think that things that would produce flatulence would be the opposite of sexy in my mind, like beans.
Oh yes. Oh yes. But beans were considered potentially aphrodisiac because they puffed the penis up.
Okay, there's also this really interesting kind of cultural history of like something being exotic or hard to find in a particular moment makes it considered romantic or sexy, like potatoes. I need you to explain how potatoes
Mhm.
became sexy.
Mhm. Yeah, potatoes initially, well, potatoes are a New World crop, right? They come out of the Andes, out of present day Peru. And so they're very exotic when they first arrive in Europe. And they are initially believed potentially to be an aphrodisiac, as is chocolate, another New World crop that comes out of Mesoamerica. And you can find references to potatoes being an aphrodisiac in Shakespeare. Later, they lose their aphrodisiac reputation. But I still think like potato chips can be a lovely aphrodisiac.
What makes them sexy to you?
Oh, there's a wonderful scene in a book by MFK Fisher where she describes eating potato chips with a lover, like these wonderful golden fried and potato chips in a hotel in Switzerland. And it's just like an incredibly like sexy and indulgent scene. And I think like any food that we're eating purely for pleasure and not for nutritive value has that aphrodisiac association.
So I want to go now back to your personal story. So we had situated you as someone growing up in New York City, studying in New York City. After you got your PhD, you and your husband at the time and your two children moved to Paris for a year. This was in 2013. Paris kind of plays such a big part in our cultural imagination around sexy food. So what was that like to be there for you?
Well, I spent a lot of that year shopping for food and cooking food. I'd at that point, I had my PhD for about a decade, so I
Okay.
had been working, after a long period of study, raising 2 kids, writing my first book, getting tenure, so it had been a lot of hard work, and then I had this year-long sabbatical in Paris. We were living in a small apartment, no dishwasher and no laundry machine. And so a lot of my days I spent like walking to markets. My husband at the time was working for a company based on the East Coast of the US. So he didn't have to start work until late in the day, Paris time. So we would send the kids off to school. And then the two of us would walk to some market every day and we
Mm.
would go pick out food from the market together and come home. And then I would like cook a big meal. And it was the first opportunity I'd had to indulge myself that way really since I had kids because when I was a graduate student and writing my dissertation and having children, I gave up cooking. So did feel incredibly indulgent and wonderful. And the ingredients in Paris were so great. And actually, the funny thing is, I think we went to Paris expecting to like eat out in restaurants and really enjoy restaurant food, but we didn't that much. What we really enjoyed was the amazing quality of the ingredients in the market.
Yes. So you had this experience of kind of living a very European lifestyle, I guess. But you also were there to research. As you said, you were on a sabbatical. You were researching food history and sexuality history. I guess I'm curious about a particular moment where you started to realize that there was something more to explore. It wasn't just, oh, we link food and sex because they're both from the natural world, because they both give us pleasure. There was something in particular that you were discovering in Paris that made you feel like this connection between food and sex needed further inquiry. So, what was that?
Well, initially, I wasn't researching food and sex. Initially, I was just researching food history. So I
Okay.
had at that point written 2 books. So I'd written one book about death and I'd written one book about sex. And then I thought, oh, I'll write a book about food, and then I'll have covered the whole trifecta of human experience. Sex, death, and food, I'll be done. So I started researching Americans who learned how to cook in Paris. But as I started reading memoirs of people learning how to cook in Paris, I read, Julia Child's memoir, and I read Julia Child's editor, Judith Jones's memoir, and I was reading memoirs written by the lesbians of the left bank in the early 20th century and the lost generation. And as I was reading their memoirs, there was so much about sex wrapped up with their accounts of food. And so I actually came at it sideways. The moment of realization was like, oh, like all these people are really linking food and sex in their writing, and like coming for Americans and Britons coming to Paris creates these linked sensual appetites. And I started wondering why that was, and I discovered that there was really very little written historically about how food and sex were linked in the imagination or in practice, because people, I think, have mostly assumed that it's such a natural linkage, it doesn't need explaining. But what I found when I started researching was that while, yes, food and sex are often linked over time and space, so we can find people connecting it in ancient Chinese poetry or in ancient Greek poetry or, in ancient Indian medical thought. Like you can find it all over. But how people link these things changes profoundly depending on where and when.
Coming up, Rachel takes us back to 18th century Paris, to the emergence of restaurants and their intimate ties with sex work. You're listening to Embodied from North Carolina Public Radio, a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You can also hear Embodied as a podcast. Follow and subscribe on your platform of choice. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Alan and I'm obese. Can we have a show about being fat that isn't about all the things other fat and weight loss podcasts are about?
I think I'm not hairy enough to be a bear.
And he looked down at my stomach and goes,
Right.
Oh, man.
I struggle with my weight in many different ways. Come and listen to me struggle with it alongside other fat people on the show Tubby. You can find it wherever you find your tubcasts, your podcasts.
This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao, and today we're looking into the history of food and sex. If you're planning a date in the modern era, say for Valentine's Day, booking a table for two at a restaurant is a pretty safe choice. But if you were to go back in time, like 250 years ago to the emergence of the first restaurants in Paris, things would be a little different. Restaurants were still large rooms filled with warm light, private tables, and good smells wafting in from the kitchen. But there was a heightened element of sexual allure. Going to a restaurant was a much more illicit act. And yes, we're alluding here to a history of sex work. A heads up that that's going to be part of this next segment of the conversation. Here's Rachel Hope Cleaves, historian and author of the book Lustful Appetites, an intimate history of good food and wicked sex.
A lot of those early restaurants had what were called dames de comptoir, which were women, sometimes the proprietress of the restaurant, sometimes people who'd been hired. And these women were seated on elevated seats overlooking the whole room, and they tallied the bills for the diners. So the waiters were men, were garçons, but the bill was brought to this woman, and she would tally it up and do the cash. And these women dressed provocatively. They were celebrated for their beauty. People would go to specific restaurants because of the renowned beauty of some of these dames de comptoir. And then on top of that, not all, but many of the early French restaurants had what were called cabinets particuliers, or private rooms. And these rooms were typically furnished with a table and a couple of chairs and a couch. And as Larousse, the dictionary writer, Pierre Larousse said, like the couch was the plat de résistance. That was the whole point of these rooms. They had a door that closed. They were serviced by waiters who were notoriously discreet. They wouldn't come in without knocking first. And so men, and most of these early restaurant diners were men, would bring women into these rooms, sometimes sex workers, sometimes their mistresses, sometimes innocent parties who didn't know what was in store for them. And they would eat together in the private room and then make love on the couch.
So, what was the role of food in these spaces in terms of how it was linked to sex, like both the implicit and explicit links between food on the menu and sex in these early Parisian restaurants?
Well, the word restaurant actually comes out of a broth, which was a restaurant, like a restorative broth that was intended to restore the vigor and virility of men who had, lost their virility. This is in the late 18th century, like the 1770s. And these aristocratic men were, in the thinking of the time, were like kind of fragile and like using their brains so much that they were drooping physically. So they would have these restoring broths that would like reinvigorate them and get them ready for amorous pursuits. So the first restaurants were actually institutions that sold this restorative broth and then started offering other kind of delicate and light fare. So from the very beginning, the restaurant is associated with sexuality in that way. In the private rooms, the menus varied. I found a lot of different accounts in the sources. There's a lot of like kind of aphrodisiac evoking food. So like crawfish were huge on private room menus, and they're associated, again, it's a food of the sea, with sexual seduction and sexuality. The most important part of the menu for the private room is that it was very expensive. You could expect to pay twice what you would in the public room downstairs.
Well, there was also this kickback system where the sex workers would be in partnership with the restaurateurs. I want to know more about that and maybe use the example of the champagne corks. I loved reading about that.
Oh, there's all sorts of kickback systems. So there was a champagne cork kickback system. There were sex workers who specialized in dining with men in these restaurants. They were sometimes called soupeuses. And so they would take a man they would like, get themselves invited into a private room, and then they would order champagne, and they would hold onto the corks because the champagne was expensive. And then they would come back the next day and get reimbursed a certain amount for every cork that they'd managed to collect over the evening. But restaurateurs and sex workers collaborated in all sorts of ways. So like if a restaurateur, for example, had like a bunch of a particular food that was going to go off soon, he'd be encouraging her to encouraging the sex workers to order this particular food so he wouldn't waste it, right? It's like modern day restaurant managers try to get waiters to move certain, entrees that like need to be eaten now or else they're going to end up in the garbage. They would also often decorate these private rooms with knickknacks, things like a fan, or some little thing you could buy, and the sex worker would ask her client to buy it for her, which he would, and then she would come back the next day and redeem it for, whatever, 5 francs, and it would go back up on the mantelpiece.
So just to be clear, like what we're talking about is these were the restaurants that did exist then. Like there wasn't another option of a place you could go out to eat, really. Like if you were going to go out to eat, this was the thing, which is in part why sex work and sex and food became so linked, right?
Yeah, not every restaurant had Cabernet Particulier, but they were absolutely ubiquitous. And so there was a lot of hesitance on the part of respectable women to eat in restaurants at all in the 19th century. French women were more likely to, but there were still restaurants that were considered like appropriate to bring your wife, and other restaurants which were only considered appropriate to bring your mistress. And then British and American women hesitated to eat at restaurants at all in the 19th century and often expressed a lot of hesitance and apology if they did so. Like if they wrote about it to their family back home or if they published travel diaries, they'd have to explain why, well, it was okay. It really was okay. I was eating with these other people and everybody assured me it's fine.
So tell me about how restaurant culture then flowed from Paris to the US. This was in the 1800s, and there were still remnants of sex work as part of restaurant culture. How did that go across the ocean?
Absolutely. So the first commonly agreed on restaurant in the United States is Delmonico's, which opens in Lower Manhattan in the antebellum era, and it has private rooms. And in fact, again, it's considered very disreputable Like, if you go there, you're going to see things you really shouldn't see. And eventually, Delmonico's expels sex workers, and it takes until the end of the 19th century for that to happen. So when restaurants first arrive in the United States, especially the French restaurants modeled on the Parisian standard, they often have private rooms and they often become associated with prostitution and sex work as well. That changes over time. But one of the funny things that happens is, as American cities expand and American women are joining the workforce, I'm talking about in the 19th century here, and you need places in the city for women to grab food, right? So you need respectable places for respectable women. Like, they can't mix with sex workers. You get the invention of new types of restaurants that are intended to service these respectable middle-class women. Places like ice cream parlors, so they wouldn't serve alcohol. They only served light food. They didn't have these private rooms. They're supposed to be safe spaces, but like, as soon as women start gathering in them, they immediately acquire a sexual reputation. They immediately become sexually suspect. So you start seeing people write in newspapers, so everybody knows that these ice cream saloons are really just brothels, and you can find people canoodling in them. And same thing happens when cafeterias start opening in the turn of the 20th century, to serve, again, women office workers. Like, they're supposed to be places that are acceptable for women, but as soon as women are there in large numbers, they immediately become suspicious. So just like women eating out makes people suspicious.
Totally. And I'm curious. I mean, there's a way that, I hear what you're saying as like, oh, this is a funny, moment of old history. Like, it's not like this anymore. I can go get ice cream wherever I want. I can gather in public wherever I want and eat. But you were a waitress in college, and as you were reading about this history, you really started to connect the dots between restaurant culture that you were studying about and restaurant culture that you had been immersed in. Tie that history to the present for me of kind of what still lingers.
Yeah, I think a lot of this would be familiar to anybody who's worked as a waitress, because many of these things still define waitressing as a profession. Like I mentioned, in Paris, initially, all the waiters are men. And then waitressing emerges as a profession in the mid-19th century in the United States. So you start seeing mention of waitresses in New York City in the 1850s and in San Francisco, which is in the midst of the gold rush, so in the 1850s. And from the very beginning, waitresses are seen as this very risque profession. In the book, I call it a parasexual profession, by which I mean it's not sex work, but you are, as the waitress, encouraged from the beginning to sort of flirt and hold out the possibility. A male customer thinks he might be able to get a date with you. He might be able to see you after and outside of work. He might be able to touch you on the waist or on the arm or in some other place that is not appropriate to touch women otherwise. So it's this sort of profession that evokes sexuality, the promise of sexuality. And that was still the case when I started waitressing in the mid-1990s in New York City. I was hired because I was an attractive young woman. I was willing to wear tight clothes, and smile at men and flirt with them. And I got asked out all the time by men. So the assumption was definitely that I was present and available to be asked out. And I said no to a lot of people, and a couple of people I said yes to because I thought they were cute, But yeah, my tips depended on my level of flirtatiousness and openness to men.
So I want to go back into the history a little bit. The way that we have been talking about sex and food so far is in a context that really centers men's sexuality and men's sexual exploits. So I want to talk about some of the first women who publicly centered the connection between their sexual pleasure and food. When did women start claiming food and sex for themselves?
It takes a long time because it is considered in the 19th century, in the Victorian era, it is considered extremely disreputable for women to speak about their alimentary appetites, about their hungers. You're not allowed to mention the word stomach at table. Table manners for women are, if you're going to eat a piece of bread, tear it up into tiny little pieces and eat only a tiny piece at a time. If you have an orange, you should eat it with a teaspoon.
Oh my gosh.
Never accept seconds, Don't ever allow yourself to be served the butter sauce. So women are really restricted in how they can eat in public in the 19th century. And so you can imagine how restricted they were about what they could write about food. One of the first people to challenge that is an American woman who was living in London named Elizabeth Robbins Pennell, who was a saloniste. She had a salon and she wrote art criticism, and she also started writing a food column for a cutting edge newspaper of the time. And instead of writing recipes, her food columns were these like evocative descriptions of sort of food as a sensuous pleasure. And she eventually gathers them into a book, which is subtitled The Diary of a Greedy Woman, called The Feasts of Autolycus. So I see her as this really groundbreaking woman food writer. And she's followed by like a subsequent generation in the early 20th century of like women who start writing about their sensual appetites, like in the 1920s and 1930s. And it is considered at that time very risque. And honestly, those critiques of women who write about food have not let up. I think they are still with us.
I want you to read a sample from one of the women in this cohort that we've been talking about so we can kind of understand, how risque was it really? What is the content of what they're writing about? So there was a 19-year-old writer from Montana named Mary McLean, and she wrote a memoir in 1902, and she spent 7 pages describing the act of savoring a single green olive. So can you read me an excerpt from that essay?
Absolutely. And Mary McLean, the rest of her memoir is very risque as well because she outs herself as bisexual in the memoir. The memoir, she wanted to call it I Await the Devil's Coming. So she's describing herself as like this incredible bohemian, in the words of the time, both sexually and in terms of her appetites. She writes, I take the olive in my fingers and I contemplate its green oval richness. It makes me think at once of the land where the green citron grows, where the cypress and the myrtle are emblems, of the land of the sun, where human beings are delightfully, enchantingly wicked, where the men are eager and passionate, and the women gracefully developed in mind and in body, and their 2 breasts show round and full and delicately veined beneath thin drapery. I set my teeth and my tongue upon the olive and bite it. It is bitter, salt, delicious. The saliva rushes to meet it, and my tongue is a happy tongue. As the morsel of olive rests in my mouth and is crunched and squeezed lusciously among my teeth, a quick, temporary change takes place in my character. She goes on for another 7 pages.
You were in Paris. We situated you. You described this routine that you and your husband at the time had of the mornings together and of cooking together. What was the role that food and sex played in y'all's joint life in that season?
Well, from the beginning, my husband courted me with food.
Uh-huh.
So that was true from the very, very start. I think one of the first dates we ever went on, he brought me homemade, like fresh plain yogurt with fruit mixed in. I was in my teens at the time. And, our first serious date when we got together and stayed together was to see a concert in the park in New York City. And he brought this wonderful picnic, which included olives, which, again, I was just learning to enjoy. I was in my late teens. And I remember eating olives and then, kissing, and our tongues were slick with olive oil, like the juice of the olives. And I think the first time I came to his apartment, he cooked me a brook trout with lemon and ginger. So, yeah, he courted me. He courted me through food, and it entirely worked.
I love this. So one of the themes that comes up a lot in your book is kind of who is praised for and who is allowed to enjoy good food and good sex. And we have these narratives that we've been talking about of women and queer folks who've had to push back against claims that they were sexually deviant to be able to own their appetites and really enjoy food. When did food shift away from associations with sexual immorality or sexual deviancy?
Well, throughout most of the 20th century, I think that enjoyment of food is really seen as sexually suspicious, sexually illicit, and especially in the mid-20th century, and especially for men, like being very interested in food marks you as gay. So during the 1950s and 1960s, you really get the peak of this, what we call in history of sexuality, the homosexual, heterosexual binary, and this extreme like fixation on like, and I put this in quotation marks, and like the homosexual is like a type, right? And the homosexual man is effeminate and loves food and knows about food. And that, I think, remains powerful really throughout much of the late 20th century. It was still very much a way of thought when I was growing up. And then in the 80s, you get the emergence of this new category called the foodie. So the word is invented in the mid-80s. And from the beginning, it is like a marketing term. Like businesses are marketing to foodie. And what a foodie is, I argue in the book, is basically a way of taking this reputation of the gourmet, which has been, so stained by sexual aspersions, and especially for men, by this sort of stain of queerness, and making an interest in food safe for straight men so that you can sell them products. So basically, when you create the foodie, then you open up this whole market of straight men who can buy things with their salaries, like pasta machines and now sous vide machines, or like whatever the newest gadget is. So the foodie to me is basically this like straight washing of this queer tradition. Like you can be a foodie and gay, and there's like there's books that come out in the mid-80s about like what is the foodie, and they say as much, but being a foodie doesn't make you gay, right? Like you can be straight and a foodie. So the foodie makes enjoyment of good food safe for straight men. Even so, like I said, I do think there is a lingering suspicion of women who are like really, really, really into food, that there is something, it says something about their sexual appetites. And women chefs or like women food writers, are now like women food bloggers and food influencers or whatever, are still totally, many of them are still really marketed that way.
Rachel is going to stay with us just ahead to talk about how our definitions of good food and good sex today compare to what they've been in the past. As always, you can hear the podcast version of this show by following Embodied on your platform of choice. Please stay with us.
It's easy to know you want to make a change in your life, but it is hard to actually do it. How to Be a Better Human from TED is a podcast for when self-help feels too daunting or just not for you. I'm Chris Duffy, the host of How to Be a Better Human, and trust me, I do not have it all figured out. But join me as I talk to experts about actually attainable ways we can try to improve our lives. Whether it's facing fears, setting boundaries, cleaning your house, or all sorts of other topics. Find How to Be a Better Human wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Embodied. I'm Anita Rao. For a long stretch of history, rich, indulgent food was linked to illicit or immoral sex. That argument is the backbone of Rachel Hope Cleave's book, Lustful Appetites, An Intimate History of Good Food and Wicked Sex. Rachel is a historian who's taken us through more than 2 centuries of food and sex chronicles. From the emergence of the restaurant in Paris, to food writing from queer American women in the early 1900s, to the modern-day definition of a foodie. But what are the links between good food and good sex today?
So things have changed radically, I think, in the 21st century. And I see it all the time when I'm talking to my students. I'm a professor at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. And so most of my students were born in the 21st century at this point, right? And they don't hold these same associations between luxurious food and illicit sexuality, between the restaurant and sex, or between gay men and gourmet food. Like this is all in the past for them. But what they are very concerned about now, which is something I didn't grow up with particularly, is this obsession with like what they think of as clean food or pure food. So I get a lot of students coming into my food history classes who are very concerned with health. And in my book, I describe this as a shift from what I jokingly call the old world of good food, bad sex, or a link between indulgent food and illicit, sensuous sexuality to now we're in a new world of bad food, good sex, where we think that now we think that like sexual pleasure is good. It's no longer morally problematic to have sex outside of marriage. It's a lot less morally problematic now, depending on where you live, to have sex with people of the same sex or gender as you. But now we have this, I think, increasingly rigid belief that in order to have like good, pleasurable sex, you have to have like an appropriately sexy body, which means you have to be slim, which means you have to starve yourself of calories. So now we connect instead of like heavily sensuous food with erotic sexual experience. Now I see a lot of wellness influencers and cookbooks promoting like what they call clean food or pure food as the key to good sex. Like if you have to have a juice fast, all vegetable, all plant food diet in order to maintain good erections. Like I've seen that in cookbooks. You can't have good erections if you eat meat, Or you can't have again, I have seen this in cookbooks. Like you won't have vaginal lubrication unless you're eating, juice fasts.
Oh my gosh.
And
Well,
exactly,
It's interesting because, I mean, as you're saying this, for some reason, the image that really came to my mind was I'm a 90s kid, and I feel like there was this era where yogurt commercials were all like zoomed in women very sensually eating yogurt. And it was like a way of like selling this like healthy food, but it was so sexualized. And I mean, I'm curious about like, there's so much going on here. It's like there's the diet culture influence of like whose bodies are good bodies and whose bodies are sexy. There's like the way our thinking about food culture and what is healthy food has changed. Do you think that we think different foods are sexy now because of all of this, or is that mostly like a marketing thing?
I do think it cuts into the enjoyment of sensual food when you have this kind of moral discourse looming in your head that there is, something dirty about food that is enjoyable, like food that is rich in fat. Like humans, because we are evolved to eat fat and like eat carbohydrates, we find pleasure in these foods, right? But now we have this warning that like to eat these things is dirty. To eat butter is dirty. It's clogging your arteries or whatever it is. So I do think it cuts into our ability to enjoy ourselves. I would like a world where we felt less morally disciplined in what we ate and also less morally disciplined in how we expressed our sexual selves.
I'm curious how this fits back into your own story. We talked about your food relationship with your husband. You all did end up getting divorced. You are now on the dating scene. I'm curious about like what it's like for you to explore new romantic and sexual connections as your relationship with food is also evolving.
Well, we're not divorced. We're just separated.
Okay, you're just separated. Sorry, correct the facts.
But we will be divorced. So over the course of what was a very happy marriage with my ex-husband, food really, took center stage, and it became something like a familiar story, I think, for a lot of people. Like it became very domestic for us. It became, we had children, we moved, we got older. It became a way that my husband showed his love for me was by cooking for me and feeding me, and it really took center stage. And when my children grew up and moved out of the house, we decided that we wanted new adventures in life. And so we separated. And then actually one of the exciting things for me as a single person again, suddenly, which I hadn't been since I was a teenager, was like decentering food, oddly enough. It was like having the freedom to like express myself sensually, not through food, but through new experiences with new people. And so that was kind of fun and liberating for me. It was like for it not to be all about like great food, but that sometimes to be like too busy doing other things to eat dinner,
Yeah, I can read between the lines.
Yeah. So that was that was exciting and liberating for me. And then also I started cooking again, which I really hadn't done much of because it had been, like I said, this way that my ex-husband showed his love, and he is a wonderful cook. And we still eat dinner together usually once a week. So I get the best of both worlds because I still get him to, cook for me fairly regularly. I still get to enjoy that. But it was exciting for me to kind of get back in the kitchen too and cook things that he didn't particularly like, with flavors he didn't particularly like. It felt very liberating to me to say, aha, I'm going to use this ingredient dill. He hates dill. I'm like, I'm going to do a soup and put tons of fresh dill in it. So there was something, pleasurable for me about cooking to my own tastes and trying to figure out what I liked, and also kind of a freedom from food. And then also had some wonderful experiences in the last year and a half since we've been separated, with new lovers involving food, sharing oysters with somebody on a first date, or eating chocolate with somebody after a date, or whatever it is.
So in the phase of your life that you are in now, is there any ritual or routine around food that feels especially sensual or connected to sex for you?
Well, I am in a phase right now where one of my particular indulgences would be sharing a pint of ice cream with somebody at the end of an evening. After all is said and done, there is just nothing better than lying on the couch with someone. I have a gas fireplace in my living room right now, and eating ice cream together. It doesn't get better.
What flavor are we eating?
Oh, my favorite is coffee with chocolate in it. But it's hard to find a good espresso chip. I love that. If it's not that, often chocolate. I love chocolate. Chocolate does, if I believe anything is an aphrodisiac, it's definitely chocolate. But it could be fruit. Nothing too sweet. I don't like the cake, ice cream type of flavors.
Chocolate is delicious. So you write in the epilogue of your book, for too many of us, pleasure inflicts distress where it could produce joy. So how would you encourage more folks to find pleasure in the sensuality of food?
Let go of the belief in pure food, clean food, good food, bad food. All food is good food. Allow yourself to enjoy what you're eating. Eat widely. Take pleasure in it. Embrace your body. Embrace your flesh. Don't obsess about calories. And don't stigmatize some food types as good and some food types as bad. Just move your body, feed your body, enjoy your flesh.
My approach to cooking has always been pretty utilitarian. But after this conversation with Rachel, I found myself thinking about whipping up a more sensual Valentine's Day meal. But where to start? To answer that question, we've got to go straight to an expert.
If you think about it, there's foreplay with food, right? You have your appetizers, then you have your entrees, and then you have your dessert.
That's Manolo Lopez. He's a Puerto Rican chef and entrepreneur who's been cooking since he was a teenager. He says the first step in making a romantic meal is coming at it with intention.
Listen, sometimes you create dinners in very intimate settings with smaller groups, and it's kind of like you're setting the stage for your partner, right? So you think about a dinner in this dim space, and you have the candle lights, and you have the scents, and you have the wine, and when people are having that type of interaction within sexuality and within sex, you don't just jump into it. I mean, some people do, but they're doing it wrong. To do it right and to have that full course meal, then you have to come through all those stages in order to finish it.
Okay, that all sounds doable to me so far. But now let's get to the cooking. As Rachel told us, plenty of foods throughout history have been considered aphrodisiacs. But not all foods make us feel particularly sexy. Manolo's learned some do's and don'ts for Valentine's Day fare, which start with this cautionary tale.
An old story that I had on a Valentine's Day where my partner was like, I just want you to cook for me. As a chef, you're always cooking for others, so you never cook for yourself. And I'm Puerto Rican, so a lot of the food that we have is heavy on starches, heavy on pork. And I made the mistake of just creating a whole dish, like a whole meal that was just too much for that. And then by the end of the meal, like we're both bloated. So it didn't work out in that way. So definitely I've learned from my mistakes.
Noted. No to those foods that make you ready for the Netflix, but not the chill. If Manolo had a do-over for that botched Valentine's home-cooked meal, this is what he would chef up.
I already made that mistake once of doing something too hearty like mofongo and stuff like that. So let's scratch it. And I would go straight into something lighter and definitely would do something like a whole roasted fish. We work with a lot of local fishermen, so definitely head to one of the docks here in Cabaño or in San Juan and buy fish. It's probably going to be a snapper. I would ask them to scale it because that's no easy feat. And then I would bring it home and then I would debone it. And the way that I would debone it is to make sure that the fish is butterfly, bottom to top. So put that in the fridge and let it dry out a little bit. 20 minutes before roasting it in the oven. Actually, taking that back, I'm going to broil it. I'll broil it in the oven for 7 minutes. Very light seasoning, salt, a little bit of white pepper, and then you take it out. Its skin is fully crisp on top. While that's cooking 7 to 8 minutes, I'm making a salsa verde with fresh cilantro, regao, parsley, a little grated ginger, grated garlic, white balsamic vinegar, olive oil, red chili peppers, and then just let that sit. And when it comes out, definitely have some tostones next to it. It's like you can have your fried starches and stuff like that. Just not let that be the main thing. And then I would drizzle all that green salsa on top of the fish, and then we would eat it with our hands.
And to wash it all down?
Definitely a white wine. Or, if I'm trying to get things going quicker, let's do rum. We're in Puerto Rico. I would definitely get some donkey rum, some white rum, and just have something very light on top of it, like freshly squeezed grapefruit. That's it.
Yum. I would love to plan something like this myself. But let's say my culinary dreams don't quite come true. As a novice chef, I burn the fish, my salsa is too puckery, and I leave the wine in the freezer by accident. I need a backup plan. So where can you go out and ensure it will be a sensual dining experience? A place with the right mood lighting, a light yet sumptuous meal, and a tactile element to the food. Manolo says your best bet is sushi.
I think like sashimi and sushi is sexy, right? You're there at a sushi bar. The sushi master is in front of you. They bring out the loin. They bring out whatever it is, and they take out this knife, and they just, with the precision, they cut it, and then with their bare hands, they're using, they're putting in the rice and they're molding it. They put the wasabi, and then they put the little piece of fish, and then they brush it just like softly with a little bit of soy sauce, and then they just put it in front of you. And then you then have a choice whether you want to eat it with your hands or with your chopsticks. And I just can't think of something that is just like more personal than that. Also the way that it happens, the way that there is a buildup in order to have that, and then that satisfaction of understanding what's actually happening in your tongue. The front part of it and the back part of it, the saltiness of the soy, the fattiness of the tuna, how pungent the wasabi is, and the texture of the rice. Those are kind of stuff that when we have it, we talk about it in that sense. It's very sensual in the way it's made and the way it's consumed and the way it's a one-on-one thing.
A big thanks to Chef Manolo Lopez for sharing his stories with us, and to everyone listening, happy cooking. You can find out more about everyone featured on today's show at our website, embodiedwunc.org. You can find all episodes of Embodied the Radio Show there and subscribe to our weekly podcast. If you have a favorite sexy meal or recipe, we want to hear about it. Send us an email at embodied@wunc.org or record a voice memo in our virtual mailbox SpeakPipe. Find that link in the show notes of our podcast episodes or at embodiedwunc.org. You can also stay up to date by following us on Instagram. Our handle is @embodiedwunc. This program was recorded at the American Tobacco Historic District. North Carolina Public Radio is a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm Anita Rao.